Okay, my pond lovers, I hate to say it, but it is now November. It's time to start thinking about shutting down your pond. And if you haven't done so already, there's a number of different things that you want to take care of. Nets, heaters, aerators, lots of things to make sure that your fish are as happy and healthy all winter long. So this is a longer video. Please watch this one to the end. You want to make sure your babies are happy and safe all winter. Okay, so here in New England, it is now the beginning of November. So the first thing we start worrying about is leaf debris. Trees are starting to drop their leaves, depending on where you are in New England. So getting a good quality net over your pond and preventing all that leaf debris from falling in your pond is first priority. But if you're in southern Rhode Island, especially out on Aquidneck Island, not only do you have to be prepared for leaf debris, but you really want to be paying attention to the mink. The mink is on the hunt and it loves eating fish. And so we find that we'll get a few calls around this time of year. Worst of the damage will happen in February, but properly netting your pond will shut that mink right down. Okay, so for us, there's a few things you want to do when you're trying to pay attention to protect your fish. Mink, if you don't know what it is almost like a black ferret. Only needs a small gap to get underneath these nets. But whether you're preparing for the mink or not, this setup is one of the techniques that we try to do. We don't just grab a net and pull it and hang it tight over the top of the net. Problem with that is when the leaves fall on top of the net, they can sag down and really still get in the water, gunking up the water quality. So what we do is we do posts on either side with a cable going across, and that keeps the center of this almost like a tent. So when leaves fall on here, they hit the edge, they kind of fall off to the sides, and then that stops them from getting in there. But the real key to protecting from the mink is your edge work. There cannot be any gaps at all. So we have boulders or rocks that we put down on either side, and then we're taking big metal staples and stapling in between. Then right here on the edge, you have to zip tie it up nice and tight. There cannot be a single gap in the entire perimeter, or that mink can get right in there. Matter of fact, we even identified that we had to stop putting the nets over the top of the skimmer caps. And then when we're all set and done, we'll put a rock on top of here. The mink have learned that it'll just get right up underneath the skimmer cap, pop it open, and have clear access to the pond. Okay, so the mink here on Aquidneck Island especially, I tell everybody it's not if you get visited by a mink, it's when. And so you want to take extra precautions. Now there's certain areas out, say in Little Compton, really wooded areas where the mink population is excessively high. And they just learned that if they find fish, I guess the way I look at it rather is all winter long, they're picking off the local rabbits. And once the local prey population is diminished, by February, March, when the ice starts to recede off these ponds, they bred in February. So now they're trying to feed the babies or they're physically pregnant. And they just learned that these fish get so lethargic over the winter that they're easy pickings. They'll go right inside the pond and knock out 18-inch koi overnight. Biggest problem is I find they don't consume the fish, so they don't get full. I don't know if they're going after a gland or drinking the blood, but nonetheless, they'll wipe a pond out pretty quick. So a properly installed net will shut them down. In some cases, if you don't want a net, I also identified that they hunt by eyesight, not by smell or any other senses. So using a black pond dye, dyeing your water pitch black over the wintertime will also ensure that there's no gaps in the net, because some waterfalls, we have had problems where there's just too many nooks and crannies at hiding spots that we can't properly get a net on there. And they're a rodent. They're the size of a squirrel. They can get into some pretty small spaces. So properly installing a net usually works and shuts them down. Just make sure there's no holes in the nets. Sometimes people will come back saying the mink got in. Very rarely do I find they chew or dig. They're just opportunistic. If they can get into a little gap, they'll take advantage of it. So if you have holes in your net, swap it out for a new net and take care from there. Also, black pond dye, putting that in there, it'll turn it pitch black. You won't see your fish for the winter time, but your fish will be less stressful because they know if they can see out, predators can see in, so then those fish get stressed. So you have to have a little faith when using the black pond dye, but as soon as you go and do your water change in the spring and do your full cleaning, you pump all that dye out, you're back up and running, it's safe to go. Okay, so now once your net pond is netted, your fish are taken care of, the other questions we're getting is when to stop feeding your fish. The reality is, I mean, you can get into putting thermometers in there and monitor the water temperature and really dial it in. I take a pretty low-key approach to this. If my fish are hungry, I feed them. If they're not hungry, I don't feed them. And so if I stop feeding them and the food's floating right in my skimmer, or I come back 10 minutes later and it's just sitting there still, I stop. They're probably done for the season. There's enough algae and other things for them to eat in the pond. But when the water temperature gets down below, say 50, 55 degrees, not only do they just stop getting hungry, but they also, it's more important that if you're going to feed them in the cooler parts of the year, they use a low temperature fish food. Of course, as with almost everything we use, I like the Aquascape fish food. They just make a great product. But the key is when you're trying to pick out your fish food is also for the cold water, premium cold water fish food. Some systems will say spring, fall, but the key is it has to say for cold. The reason we have to use fish food for cold water is that it's a low protein fish food. It's kind of think of it as a vegetative diet for the winter. Fish will be hungry. It'll be a nice sunny day. They'll be eating, they'll be hungry. And they eat all those high proteins that are in almost all fish foods for in-season growth. But when the cold water, they can't digest those proteins. So they may be hungry during the sunny day, but then the temperature may drop pretty quick. Say at the end of November, beginning of December, we could drop 30 degrees overnight. Water temperature cools off. Those fish can't digest the proteins anymore. So around sometime in October, I switch over to a low temperature fish food. I don't have to think about it from that point. If they're hungry, I feed them. If they're not hungry, I don't. Whatever's left over, I save that for spring. And then the same thing, I do it in reverse. When the fish start waking up in the spring, I feed them the low temperature fish food. Once I know that we're in the 60s and 70s for air temperature pretty consistently, when I run out of that fish food, I just switch over to an in-season food that's high protein. That's just how I do it. You can get in deep with testing the water and watching the thermometers. Too much work for me. Okay, so finally the last thing when it comes down to keeping fish happy over the winter time is oxygen. If you have a pond and you have fish in it, you need to maintain an opening in that ice. All the fish waste, leaf debris, any gunk that's in that water is decomposing. As that decomposes, those gases get released into the water and eventually just volatilize into the air. But when winter sets in and we have an ice coverage over the pond, those gases can get trapped inside that pond and trapped in the water, slowly building up the toxic levels. So at bare bones minimum, we have to keep an opening in the ice. However, if you have big fish or a lot of fish, I say my rule of thumb is if you have fish that are bigger than 8 inches in size, or if you have, say, more than a half dozen of those fish, you need more than just an opening in the ice. You need added oxygen. And so there's a few different ways of doing that. Let's take a closer look. So this is the Old Faithful. Every manufacturer has some version of a de-icer. Now, these are not intended to heat your water in the entire pond to keep it free of ice like this. Really only intended to keep an opening in the ice. So you might just have this small space around the outside of the de-icer as it is. But that alone only keeps the opening in the ice, letting the gases out. If I'm using a heater, I am recommending some kind of small aerator to go with it. I'm not a big fan of any of these small aerators. I like the pro grade one. So if I'm doing these, I have to do them together. A heater and a small aerator. However, our best and most reliable way to overwinter fish, we use the Aquascape Pro S60. And what this does is you just have a more robust compressor with 2 diffusers. You take these, throw those inside the pond. I take this and I put this inside a Rubbermaid storage tote outside of the pond. And that just gives it a little extra protection from the winter. And that, just think of it like an aquarium bubbler. It cranks a ton of air bubbles inside that pond. Just the movement of those bubbles inside the pond is enough to keep an opening. Now, in deep cold winters, when we get here in southern Rhode Island, I find it rare that we actually go a month and a half where we never go above freezing temperatures. Those deep water aerators do an amazing job. And so I tell everybody, you don't even have to worry about it. Usually if we're freeze thaw, which a lot of our winters are, it'll keep an opening all winter long. However, if we get frozen, we stay frozen for extended periods of time, that hole may start to freeze over. But if you have one of these big compressors on it, the key is as long as you hear it running. As long as you hear it running and you walk over to the pond, you can hear the bubbling underneath the ice, it's doing its job. The pond is not, the compressor's working, it's forcing those air bubbles out of a crack somewhere. So even if it ices over, please never smash the ice. You smash the ice to go through, you can give your fish a concussion and actually kill them. And so the key is if you have a small heater or something fails, I'll cut an opening in the ice, I'll melt a hole in the ice, but I never smash a hole in the ice. Whereas if I have the deep water aerators and it ices over, as long as it's running and operating, you don't even have to think about it. It's a little bit more upfront cost, but at the same time, I've been running some of these things for 6-7 years. We're still not replacing them yet. And they just are built to last, and kind of just set it and forget it. Just periodically check on it, make sure it's running. It's the best defense I find for your fish all winter long. So that's it. In the end, net your pond, keep the critters out, keep an aerator on there, ideally the deep water aerators. But if you use the heaters, swap in a small aerator in there also. And as long as you didn't let your pond get chock-a-block full of leaves over the winter, I don't mind a few leaves. The fish actually like a little place to go and hide. But I don't want to see 6 inches of leaves inside your pond. So if you had leaves dropping your pond, get out there. If not, get a net on that pond soon. And just keep that opening in the eyes. Keep the aerators running all winter long. And it's the best defense we can do. And actually, the fish actually prefer that we get cold and stay cold. They really don't like our New England winters where we're up, down, up, down. So there are other things that you can do to help protect them. But really consistent weather, which is not that common around here, is all we can hope for wintertime. Outside of that, do what you can to set the fish up for success. And odds are they'll be fine all winter long. Hope that helps. Take care.